a look at blood. Blood. Now, blood is a vital fluid to living organisms. It is what we describe as the main medium through which necessary substances and waste products are transported to and from the cells, tissues, and organs of the body. Now, about 55% of blood is made up of a fluid called plasma. The rest 45% is comprised of cells which are suspended within that plasma. Now, this 45% of cells consists of three types of cells. There are three types of cells found in your blood: red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Now, whenever you go to the doctor and you do a blood test, they would put the needle into a blood vessel that they might find in your arm or by your elbow area there. Yeah, right? And after that, now, they would put your blood in these tubes. Now, what they do, the part that you don't see, is they would put the tubes in a device called a centrifuge, and they would spin those tubes of blood. And then now, when it comes out of the centrifuge, it looks something like this. Now, what the centrifuge does, it separates the components of the blood based on density. So the more liquidized parts will float and the more solid parts would sink, obviously. So you would see something like this. Whenever you spin blood in a centrifuge to separate the parts, you would see the liquid part of the blood being separated. That's this yellow thing. This is what we call the plasma. All right, this is the plasma. So about 55% of your blood is this plasma. Now there's about less than 1% of your blood is white blood cells, and the rest 44 to 45% of your blood would be red blood cells. Now here's something interesting. Whenever you go to the doctor, and let's say you're trying to test to see if you have a certain disease or whatever, what they tend to do when they spin the blood in the device and causes the plasma to separate from the blood cells, they would take something, extract some of the plasma, and do a test on it to see if, for example, somebody has HIV or hepatitis or some kind of bacterial infection. What they tend to do, they tend to test the plasma. That's why they want to spin it in the centrifuge so that the plasma could separate, because if there are any infections in your blood, they would show up in your blood plasma. Now, plasma is a yellowish, and you saw the yellow color here. You saw the yellow color, right? Here in the artistic work as well as the real life picture. So plasma is a yellowish fluid composed of about 90% water and 10% dissolved substances. Now, the dissolved substances in plasma consist of the following. You could have products of digestion. This includes glucose, amino acids, vitamins, and minerals. Plasma helps to transport them from the ileum to the liver and the body cells. In plasma, you could also have waste products such as carbon dioxide and urea. Carbon dioxide is transported as hydrogen carbonate ion HCO3 from the body cells to the lungs, and urea is transported from the liver to the kidney. Now, the mentioning urea sounds, familiar to a particular thing we know associated with the kidneys, which is urine. In blood plasma, you also have hormones such as insulin, thyroxine, progesterone, estrogen, all of these different types of testosterone, all of these hormones. These hormones are transported from the glands that produce them, which are called endocrine glands, to various organs when those organs would need those hormones. All right. In blood plasma, we also have plasma proteins such as fibrinogen, albumin, antibodies, etc. These proteins help in various functions, from immunity to, well, mainly immunity and other processes. There's also heat in your blood plasma. Now, heat is not a dissolved substance, but the plasma transports it from the liver and the muscles to all parts of the body. This is also kind of your blood's way of regulating your body temperature. So when plasma carries heat, it distributes that heat across your body so that you can have a constant body temperature and not freeze or burn to death. All right. Now, blood cells. Blood is made up of three main types of cells. We saw that they were called red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, but there are some more fancy names for them. They are also, red blood cells are also known as erythrocytes. White blood cells are called leukocytes, and platelets are called thrombocytes. Now, you can pause this right here and just take your time and learn them. Why I say that? Because CXC tends to ask questions about them. So it's very important that you learn these names. That red blood cells are also known as erythrocytes. White blood cells are also known as leukocytes. And platelets are known as thrombocytes. Now, erythrocytes, as you can see, also known as red blood cells, they are biconcave discs. But it looks like a kind of it looks like they have a ring with a sink in the middle. That is because they don't have nucleus. As a matter of fact, a red blood cell is probably one of the few, if not the only bodily cell that does not have a nucleus. It doesn't have a nucleus so that it could carry oxygen more easily. All right. So erythrocytes are biconcave discs with a thin center and large surface area to volume ratio so that gases can easily diffuse in and out. They do not have a nucleus and they can only live for 3 to 4 months. Now, they contain a red pigment called hemoglobin. Very important, right? Hemoglobin is what actually holds oxygen to carry it from one place to another in your body. When your hemoglobin might be defective, or when there might be issues, like for example, people who might have a low blood count or sickle cell anemia, or they might suffer from carbon monoxide poisoning or some other drug use, and it hinders your hemoglobin, it means that it's difficult for your red blood cells to take up and hold oxygen to carry it to different parts of the body. All right. Red blood cells or erythrocytes, they are slightly elastic and they're able to squeeze through narrow capillaries. All right, we get into capillaries and so on just now. Red blood cells are formed in red bone marrow, found in flat bones such as the pelvis, or that's your the bone in your waist, right? Your waistline bone there. The ribs, the cranium or the skull, and the vertebrae, which is the spinal column bones in the back. After they serve their function, red blood cells are broken down in the liver and spleen. Remember, we said that red blood cells live about for 3 to 4 months. So when they die, they are broken down by your liver and your spleen. Your spleen is on the left side of your body, right next to your pancreas there, right? Now, when the red blood cells transport oxygen, the oxygen combines with hemoglobin to form something called oxyhemoglobin. This oxyhemoglobin is carried from the lungs to body cells. And then finally, the red blood cells also transport small amounts of carbon dioxide from body cells to the lungs. This is their way of getting rid of that waste product known as carbon dioxide from our bodies. The second type of blood cell in our blood is called leukocytes, which are white blood cells. Now, leukocytes are slightly larger than red blood cells, and they're not as numerous as red blood cells, but they are important in defending our body against diseases and infections. So they therefore help us to achieve something called immunity. Very important. Now, there are two types of white blood cells, two types of leukocytes, lymphocytes and phagocytes. Lymphocytes and phagocytes. So let's take a look at lymphocytes. Lymphocytes, they have a rounded shape They have a large wrong nucleus that controls the production of antibodies. And of course, when you see antibodies, think about immunity, think about fighting diseases, right? They have a small amount of cytoplasm. They develop from cells in red bone marrow and mature organs such as lymph nodes, the spleen, and your thymus gland. They produce antibodies to destroy disease-causing bacteria and viruses known as pathogens, and they produce antitoxins to neutralize toxins produced by pathogens. All right, so whether you let's say you get things like food poisoning and so on as a result of toxic pathogens and so on that may be in food, your lymphocytes and your white blood cells in general would help to fight against those pathogens. Or let's say you get sick with the common cold, influenza, COVID, or whatever, and the virus is in your body, your white blood cells would fight against them. As a matter of fact, sometimes there are certain white blood cells, we refer to them as memory cells, because what they do is even when white blood cells fight against diseases, they tend to memorize the disease. So even when you get even when or if you might get infected with like a viral infection again, it would remember that and it would know how better to fight it because it has memory of that. That's real cool if you ask me, right? So this is a lymphocyte. As you can see, they're always rounded. They have a really large nucleus, as you can see there. A little bit of cytoplasm, right? A little bit of cytoplasm. And that is, of course, because of the large nucleus. They produce antibodies and antitoxins. They're very versatile. Now, the thing with lymphocytes is that in order to break down pathogens and so on, they would send their antibodies and antitoxins to deal with the pathogens. But then there is this second type of white blood cell, phagocytes. Now, phagocytes are not always rounded like a lymphocyte. They can have varying shapes. Most of them move by something called a pseudopodia, also known as a false foot, which is just an extended part of its cytoplasm. It just kind of pushes out its cytoplasm a bit to act as a foot to help it swim or crawl along, right? Now, the phagocytes operate, they don't send out necessarily antibodies and so on. What phagocytes do is they swallow or they engulf pathogens using their pseudopodia. So while lymphocytes might use antibodies to help break down pathogens, phagocytes are actually basically eating the pathogens, right? They engulf and destroy pathogens as well as engulf the remains of pathogens that were destroyed by antibodies produced by lymphocytes. They also, meaning phagocytes also have a lobe-shaped nucleus and a large amount of cytoplasm, and they are formed in red bone marrow. Now, this is a phagocyte. And as you can see, the phagocyte is attempting to eat the bacterium. It's attempting to eat it. Wow. All right, so that's what we're talking about. Usually when a lymphocyte try and break down some pathogens, the phagocyte will try and clean up the remains. Very interesting, eh? So then we took a look at red blood cells, erythrocytes. We took a look at white blood cells, leukocytes. Now let's take a look at the third type of cell found in blood, thrombocytes, also known as your platelets. You hear a lot about this, especially when people might have to go to the doctor or to the hospital because their platelet levels are low. Now, platelets are fragments of cells. A platelet is not really a whole cell, it's just a fragment of a cell. Platelets have no nucleus and they only live for about 10 days. Now, check this out, right? Red blood cells only live for about 3 to 4 months. They don't have a nucleus. Platelets only live for about 10 days. They don't have a nucleus. It shows you that an essential part to a cell being alive is its nucleus. If a cell has a nucleus, it could be alive for a much longer time than a cell without a nucleus. Now, thrombocytes or platelets are formed from cells in the red bone marrow. and they help the blood to clot at a cut or an injury. So even when you get a cut or when you get injured, your thrombocytes are there to help heal that clot, help heal that cut, to help heal that bruise, to help heal that injury. So this is an artistic impression of your red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets all flowing in your blood. You can see the red blood cells, those big dish-shaped structures carrying oxygen and so on. You could see your white blood cells where they produce antibodies and antitoxins, and they're eating stuff like the phagocytes, you know. And then, of course, you see your platelets that are helping your blood to clot, to prevent excessive bleeding and so on. Now, seeing that we were talking about thrombocytes, this is a good time that we could come in and speak about blood and immunity. How does blood help us in fighting diseases? We were just talking about white blood cells and thrombocytes and how they help us in that regard. Now, immunity refers to the ability of the body to temporarily or permanently defend itself against a disease or infection. Now, the thrombocytes or the platelets and the leukocytes or the white blood cells are responsible for achieving immunity in the blood. This shows how important blood is. It is not just for transporting material, it is also for defending against diseases. Now, first of all, let's take a look and see how platelets would help us in achieving, platelets also known as thrombocytes, how do they help us in achieving immunity? Now, when your skin is bruised or cut, platelets release an enzyme called thromboplastin. With the help of calcium ions and vitamin K in the blood, thromboplastin converts a protein called fibrinogen into fibrin. Fibrin forms a network of fibers across the cut or bruise to trap blood cells and form a clot. This clot is what we call a scab. So let me show you a little diagram with this. So let's say this is the bruise, and all of these red blood cells coming out here is basically you bleeding. But what happens then? When the body realizes this is happening, it produces fibrinogen, and fibrinogen turns into a protein called fibrin. The fibrin starts to bind up. You see what happening here? It starts to bind up platelets and the red blood cells together. And when it does this, it creates something called a scab. A scab is that black thing that if you have a cut or a bruise, after a while of healing, it forms over the cut or bruise. So it'll feel kind of tough. Sometimes it might, sometimes this scab might scratch you. Sometimes it might itch you a bit. But that is what it's there for. It's this. More than likely, you might have one somewhere on your body because, you know, we might always be butting up a bruise in ourselves and so on. But that is why immunity is so very important. Now, this is a diagram here from a textbook showing you how white blood cells or leukocytes, how they achieve immunity. Now, foreign substances are what we call antigens, right? When antigens come into contact, any foreign substance that enters your body, from any bacteria, from any virus, any protozoan, they produce things called antigens, proteins called antigens. Now, when an antigen comes into contact with your lymphocytes, remember lymphocytes is the type of white blood cell that produces antibodies, right? When they come into contact with your lymphocytes, they stimulate the lymphocytes to produce antibodies. All right? So let me say this is the bacteria down here. These are your lymphocytes. The bacteria naturally produce proteins called antigens. Viruses do the same thing. Protozoans do the same thing. Any infections, they do the same thing, produce antigens, right? Your lymphocytes recognize this, and your lymphocytes produce antibodies that would then respond to those antigens to help destroy the bacteria or the viruses or whatever. Now, when the lymphocytes are finished doing that, when they send out antibodies, look at what it says here, right? First of all, lymphocytes recognize antigens on the surface of bacteria as foreign, and they produce antibodies against them. Now, you can see the key over here. The antibodies is the upside down Y-looking thing. The antigens are represented by the triangles. You see them on the bacteria. Now, the antibodies from your lymphocytes, look at what they do. The antibodies stick to the antigens on the bacteria. You see that? So on top of the triangles, you have the Y-shaped antibodies now sticking onto the antigens of your bacteria. And they cause the bacteria to clump up together. You see, they cause them to stick together. That's interesting, right? Then the phagocyte comes and eats them. This is the pseudopodia, the extension of its cytoplasm, where it just engulfs them like a Pac-Man and just eats them. The bacteria are completely enclosed in a vacuole where they are killed by the phagocyte. Right. You see that? That's so interesting, eh? Our body is so amazing. So you can pause this, look at the diagram again to show you how white blood cells get rid of pathogens, of infections. All right. So speaking about immunity, it is very important to consider how our body defends itself and how we also help to facilitate the defense of our body. So the body has several defenses against pathogens. External defenses aim to prevent pathogens from entering the body, and internal defenses operate inside the body to disable and kill pathogens which have managed to enter the body. Now, our concern is right now about our internal defenses. External defenses would be things like washing your hands, wearing a mask, cleaning your clothes, being careful, those kind of things, right? But internal defenses now, we want to see exactly what our body does to ensure that it protects itself against diseases. The body's defense against diseases are known collectively as the immune system. The immune system consists of the skin, parts of the respiratory system, parts of the digestive system, and of course, the blood. Now, the figure below here shows you the main components of the immune system and their role in defending the body against pathogens. So this is a good diagram to show you how the body functions. What I would encourage you to do, just pause the video, and just take a look at the different defenses that the body has. You have, for example, defenses in your glands, in your nose, in your eyes, in your skin. Even for ladies, you would have a defense in your cervix, where a plug of mucus acts as a barrier to microorganisms, right, to prevent like uterine and vaginal infections and so on. So you can pause this, take a read at each point and get, a better understanding of how our immune system functions, how it operates. Now, we would have taken a look and saw how platelets, just a while ago, we saw how platelets help to clot up wounds by producing fibrinogen, by producing fibrin from fibrinogen, or what we know as producing a scab. All right. Now, immunity is the body's resistance to a specific condition or disease. Now, when a specific pathogen, such as measles, enters the body and is destroyed by internal defenses, we describe the person as being immune to that disease. The immunity may last for a short time, or it could be that it lasts for a lifetime. Now, the body's immune system or immune response is its reaction to being invaded by specific foreign materials, such as viruses, bacteria, toxins, or other unrecognized proteins. The body recognizes that these substances are foreign and it responds by trying to destroy them. Substances which cause an immune response are called antigens. The antigens, remember, we just saw it, the antigens are what would be on the surface of bacteria and viruses and so on. Now, the immune response involves the lymphocytes. Remember, they produce the antibodies and the production of antibodies, right? These are proteins which the body produces in response to specific antigens. The antibodies bind onto the targeted antigens and destroy them. All right, so we already learned how antibodies and antigens function, how antibodies stick to antigens. The antigens are located on the surface of bacteria, viruses. When antibodies from our lymphocytes stick to those antigens, they help them to clump together, and our phagocytes then destroy those pathogens. All right. Now, there are two types of immunity, and we want to take a look at them and understand them. First of all, there is natural immunity, and we have been taking a look at natural immunity. This is the action of our thrombocytes or platelets and our white blood cells or leukocytes. This is how our body naturally prevents infection, or how it naturally fights against diseases or fights against pathogens. It fights against them by, first of all, with your white blood cells producing antibodies that would stick to antigens. That's done by your lymphocytes. And then your phagocytes now would destroy those pathogens where the antibodies are stuck to them, right? Another way in which natural immunity occurs, we just saw it, where our platelets help to clot up infections, because if you get a bruise, you don't want the bruise to just be open like that. It could get infected. So platelets have to clot it up now so that it could heal. It could heal properly and not get infected. All right, clot it and cover it up with the scab. That's why if you get a cut and it forms a scab over time and it scratches you, when you sometimes dig it too much, you cause the wound to bleed again, because the scab has to cover the wound while it heals. When the wound is healed, you realize you're able to move that scab with ease because the wound has now been healed. All right, the wound has now been healed. But then there is another type of immunity, and it is called artificial immunity. Artificial immunity. And whenever we think about artificial immunity, there's one thing that must come to our mind, and that is immunization, or basically taking a vaccine, right? Now, immunization, well, taking a vaccine is the most popular form of immunization, right? Now, immunization is the process of protecting a person from a disease or making them immune to a disease by giving them a substance by mouth or by injection that provides artificial immunity. Immunization can promote active or passive immunity to disease-carrying microorganisms. Now, the substance that is injected or swallowed is called a vaccine. And the process of being immunized is called immunization or vaccination. So whenever you think about artificial immunity, we're thinking about immunization, or what we know as vaccination. Now, vaccines are made from one of the following. They are made from either dead microorganisms. For example, whooping cough vaccine is made from dead whooping cough bacteria. They are made from a weakened form of the microorganism that is harmless. So like vaccines made like this are called attenuated vaccines. Now, you don't necessarily have to remember this term, but it's still very important to consider. The vaccine against tuberculosis, for example, is an attenuated vaccine, because what they do, they take a weakened form of tuberculosis, right? Something that can't harm you, and then they use it to make a vaccine that inject into you. Now, what happens with vaccines? Well, we're going to see what happens with vaccines, all right? Vaccines are also made from a substance from the disease-causing microorganism, which does not itself cause the disease, for example, like the diphtheria vaccine. Now, you realize in general, to make a vaccine, you have to have access to the particular bacteria or virus it fights against, and then you kind of use that bacteria or virus in a harmless way to produce a vaccine, all right? So this is where we will later on we'll take a look, and in an upcoming recording we'll take a look at like genetic engineering to see how genetic engineering is used to produce new vaccines and so on, right? Now, how do vaccines work? There are two types of vaccination. There is active and there is passive vaccination. One provides active immunity and the other provides what we call passive immunity. Now, active immunity is acquired when the person is given a vaccine consisting of antigens. This stimulates the lymphocytes to produce antibodies specific to that antigen. These antibodies remain in the blood for a long time to provide a defense that can eliminate the microorganism should it infect the body in the future. Active immunity is acquired when you are vaccinated against diseases such as measles, tuberculosis, polio, diphtheria, and whooping cough. And in some cases, the levels of immunity may drop off over time, and booster infections may be needed to maintain the levels of immunity. So, for example, the polio vaccine is given to babies, and then a booster injection is given at ages 5 and 15. All right. This is one that we're very, very familiar with, right? Now, passive immunity is acquired when the person is given a vaccine consisting of antibodies produced by another organism in response to infection by a specific pathogen. This method is used when the person has been exposed to an antigen but has no immunity. So, for example, pregnant women who are exposed to German measles may be given a vaccine made from human serum or other antibodies for human serum. And if you cut yourself deeply on something dirty, you are given a tetanus injection made from antibodies. Passive immunity is important for babies because babies are not able to make their own antibodies. So passive immunity kind of ensures that antibodies are pumped into the babies until the babies are able to make their own antibodies, which tends to be around 3 months old, right? That's why babies also need to consume breast milk, because the mother breast milk help to also provide antibodies to the babies. Now, we probably have been immunized against some communicable diseases. Children are routinely vaccinated against 6 of these diseases that used to cause many deaths. We think about things like diphtheria, tetanus, whooping cough, poliomyelitis, tuberculosis, and like German measles. You can pause the video and take a look at all that they do. So in a sense, active immunity is basically where we take vaccines as like a preventative measure, right? This is where the vaccine would consist of an antigen where we expose ourselves via a vaccine to the antigens that will belong to a particular microorganism. Our body, our white blood cells will then remember those antigens, fight against them, and then they will remember them. So then when we get infected, or if we get infected by the disease, right, they should remember how to fight against those diseases, right? A passive immunity is where the vaccine consists of antibodies. This is usually where you are now giving antibodies to help fight an infection. All right. Active immunity it's taken in sorry. Active immunity is kind of taken into account, or taking it as you already having antibodies to fight. So it's kind of strengthening your antibodies. But passive immunity, it's coming as if they're saying you need antibodies. Let's give you antibodies. So like when you take your shot, when you take like a baby taking vaccines and so on, it's like you're pushing the antibodies in so that they could fight the antigens. Remember, antibodies are produced by your lymphocytes, and the antibodies fight against antigens because the antigens are produced by viruses and bacteria and so on. Always remember that. Very, very important. All right, very, very important to consider. Now, before we get to the rest of the circulatory system, we want to take a look at some problems we may encounter with our immune system. Now, the immune system does not always work properly because sometimes it may overfunction and it can lead to what we call hypersensitivity. And it could even lead to autoimmune diseases. Now, in hypersensitivity, the immune system attacks body tissue instead of microorganisms. And this could lead to different conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis and all of these different things, right? Sometimes, it's a good example of this too, even when persons may be allergic to certain things. because of hypersensitivity now, it could cause allergies, reactions, and so on. That could kind of make your life a bit miserable, if you understand what I mean. So sometimes your immune system could become very hypersensitive. But sometimes your immune system may also underfunction, and it could lead to immune deficiency diseases, like if you're not eating proper foods and all of these things. Also, if you are exposed to certain microorganisms. So, for example, HIV. HIV, which causes a condition called AIDS, it attacks the T lymphocyte cells that causes the body to be vulnerable to other infections. So the same lymphocyte, what HIV does and why HIV is so dangerous. Remember, we were just saying that lymphocytes produce pathogens. Not sorry. We're just saying the lymphocytes produce antibodies. Well, what HIV does, it goes straight for the lymphocyte and it tries to destroy those lymphocytes. It attacks those lymphocytes. If you don't have lymphocytes, then your lymphocytes can't produce antibodies. And if you don't have antibodies, they can't stick to the antigens on viruses or bacteria. And if they can't do that, your phagocytes can't go and consume anything because they won't have something to help guide them to consume anything. So once it attacks your lymphocytes, HIV basically shuts down your immune system. Crazy, crazy, crazy. Just like that, right? So it is very important then that we take measures in strengthening our immune system. Simple measures: eating healthy, resting well, exercising. Those things are very, very important.